I'm Margaret Lewis. I'm 77 years old, a retired elementary school teacher from Jacksonville, Florida. And last year, my daughter-in-law stood in my living room and told me I was nothing but a burden. She said it like she was swatting away a fly in front of my son and my grandchildren, as if I hadn't spent my entire life building that home for them to even stand in. My son didn't say a word. I can still see his face looking down at the floor while she glared at me, her voice sharp and cold. My chest felt hollow in that moment, like someone had scooped me out and left only my skin standing there, pretending to smile for the sake of appearances. All I could think was how quiet the room was, like the whole world was waiting for me to break. I thought maybe my son would speak up, tell her to stop, but he just stood there, his hands stuffed in his pockets, avoiding my eyes. It felt like a betrayal so deep it didn't even have a name. I kept staring at him, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he stayed silent. That silence hurt more than her words. In that silence, I heard every forgotten holiday, every unreturned phone call, every dinner where they left my chair empty. It hit me all at once that the people I had sacrificed everything for didn't see me as their mother anymore. They didn't see me at all. I stood there numb, feeling my cheeks burn, as my granddaughter glanced up at me with wide, confused eyes. My daughter-in-law's words still hung in the air like smoke, thick and impossible to ignore. I wanted to scream, to ask how they could say something like that to me in my own home, but my throat closed up and the words stayed trapped inside. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what it feels like when your family decides you don't matter anymore. That's the moment I realized something inside me was changing. I couldn't let them decide who I was or what I was worth. Not anymore. When I was a young woman, I thought my life would be simple. I got married right out of college and started teaching the next fall. I remember walking into that bright little classroom for the first time, the chalk dust in the air, and feeling like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I spent 42 years in that same elementary school teaching generations of kids how to read, how to add and subtract, how to believe in themselves when no one else would. There were days when I stayed late to help struggling students catch up, nights when I wrote lesson plans until midnight, and summers spent tutoring neighborhood kids who couldn't afford camp. My home was always open to them, too. When my husband fell ill, I didn't hesitate. I worked all day and came home every evening to care for him. At first, it was little things, driving him to appointments and making sure he took his pills, but eventually it became everything. I bathed him, fed him, helped him in and out of bed. He was the love of my life, and I didn't mind. We never had much money, but we made do. I clipped coupons, shopped at thrift stores, saved every penny I could to buy this house. I can still remember the day we signed the papers. I felt like I'd climbed a mountain. This house was supposed to be our little piece of the world, a place to grow old together and for our son to always feel welcome. Raising him wasn't easy, but I gave him everything I had. I worked double shifts when he needed braces. I skipped vacations to pay for his college. I even cashed out a retirement account so he could afford the down payment on his first home. I thought that was what mothers did. Even after my husband passed and the house got quiet, I found ways to keep it full of love. Neighborhood kids still came by after school for cookies and help with homework. Some called me Miss Margaret, even when they were taller than me. I loved hearing their laughter in these rooms. It made me feel like my life still mattered. But somewhere along the way, my own family stopped seeing me that way. They stopped visiting except to borrow money or ask for favors. Holidays got smaller, phone calls fewer. I tried to tell myself they were busy, that it wasn't personal. Until that day in the living room when my daughter-in-law's words cut through me like glass. All I could think about was how many nights I'd stayed up nursing her sick husband as a baby. How many mornings I'd walked into that school with my head high, no matter how tired I was, how much of myself I'd poured into everyone else. And now they stood there looking at me like I was nothing but a problem to get rid of. It hurt more than I can ever explain. Not just because they said it, but because deep down, I could see in their eyes they meant it. Everything I'd done all the years I'd sacrificed and worked and loved felt like it had disappeared, like it had never been enough. I used to feel so proud of this house, of what it stood for. I'd look at the walls and remember the birthday parties and Christmas mornings and first days of school. I thought it would always be a home filled with love. Now it just felt like a place they wanted to strip me of. And standing there, I couldn't help but wonder what all those sacrifices had really been for. Not for this. Not to be treated like an old coat hung in a closet, forgotten and unwanted. That thought stayed with me long after they left, echoing through the empty rooms. I had given them everything, and now they acted like I had nothing left to give. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was little things like the way my daughter-in-law rolled her eyes when I repeated myself, or the way my son brushed off my suggestions at family dinners. I told myself they didn't mean anything by it, that maybe I was just being too sensitive. Then it became harder to ignore. They stopped inviting me to certain family outings, saying it would be too much for me or that it was just for the younger ones. They stopped asking for my opinion when they made decisions about the holidays or the children. Instead of including me, they'd announce what they were doing and expect me to go along quietly. The comments about my age grew sharper too. My daughter-in-law would sigh and say things like, "You wouldn't understand, it's a different time now." My son would chuckle when I fumbled with my phone or needed help paying a bill online. They spoke about me like I wasn't even in the room sometimes, as if I was already fading from relevance. One afternoon, I overheard them talking about my pension. They assumed I'd just let them use it, said it was going to waste sitting in my account. The next month, I noticed withdrawals I hadn't approved. When I confronted my son, he waved me off and told me not to worry, that he knew what was best. I felt my cheeks burn, but I didn't know how to argue without sounding ungrateful. The final blow came during what they called a family meeting. They sat me down at my own kitchen table and explained that the house was too big for me now. My daughter-in-law smiled thinly as she said it would just make sense for me to move into a nice facility where I could be looked after properly. My son kept his eyes on the table, nodding along. I sat there while they spoke about my life like it was some kind of burden they were forced to carry. Every word cut a little deeper, every false smile chipped away at something inside me. By the time they stood and left the room, all I could hear was my own heart pounding in my chest. That night, I walked through every room of the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the pictures on the shelves. I felt the weight of every birthday party and Christmas morning and quiet evening I'd spent here, and I knew I wasn't ready to let go. I wasn't ready to let them take everything I had worked for. Somewhere between the anger and the hurt, a new feeling started to grow. It was small at first, just a flicker of defiance, but it grew brighter the more I thought about their words and their smirks. I realized that as much as they wanted me to feel powerless, I wasn't. Not yet. By the time I laid my head on my pillow, I could feel something shifting inside me. It wasn't just heartache anymore. It was resolve, quiet, steady, and stronger than anything they could take from me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while their voices from earlier in the day echoed in my head, each word sharp and deliberate, reminding me how unwanted I'd become in my own home. My chest felt heavy as tears welled up and slid down the sides of my face into the pillow without a sound. At some point, I rose and walked down the hall, the quiet creak of the floorboards, the only thing breaking the silence. I opened the closet where I kept my old keepsakes and pulled down the small wooden box that held pieces of my life no one else cared to remember. Inside, on top of a stack of papers and cards from former students, was a photo of my first classroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding that photo, tracing the edges of it with my thumb. The smiling children looking up at me from their desks, the bright bulletin board I used to change with every season, the sunlight through the tall windows. I remembered how alive I felt back then, how every morning had a purpose, how every day felt like I was building something that mattered. There was a note tucked behind the photo that I hadn't seen in years. It was from a colleague who had retired before me. In her careful handwriting, she'd written, "Don't forget you deserve to dream too." For a long time, I believed that. I stared at her words until they blurred. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped dreaming. I'd convinced myself it was enough to keep giving and giving to let everyone else come first. But tonight, sitting here clutching that photo, I finally asked myself what was left of me when everyone else had taken what they wanted. I thought of the house of all the birthdays and holidays and quiet nights that had lived within its walls. I thought of my husband's smile, my son's laughter as a boy, my own pride every time I turned the key in the door. And then I thought of how they had stood there today, talking about me as if I were nothing but a burden to be moved aside. The tears stopped. I set the photo on the nightstand and sat up a little straighter. My heart still hurt, but underneath the pain, something stronger had started to take hold. I realized then that if I didn't take my happiness into my own hands now, no one else ever would. If I didn't stand up for myself now, I never would. When I finally lay back down, I felt different. My mind was clear. My hands were steady. I closed my eyes, knowing what I had to do. Tomorrow, I would begin. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, I was at the kitchen table with a notepad and a cup of coffee, writing down everything I needed to do. The house was still quiet, the air heavy with the memory of yesterday. But something inside me felt lighter already. I made a list of names, numbers, and steps, like it was any other project I'd tackled in my life, except this one was for me. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with a real estate agent a neighbor had recommended years ago. Her voice was warm and professional, and she didn't flinch when I told her I wanted the house listed immediately. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. She came by that afternoon, walked through the house with a practiced eye, and assured me we'd get an excellent price. While she put the listing together, I started packing. Not the way you do when you're just moving across town, but carefully, deliberately choosing only the things I couldn't bear to leave behind. A few framed photos, the wooden box of keepsakes, a stack of letters from former students tied with a ribbon. Everything else I left in its place. Let them figure out what to do with it after I was gone. I called my bank next, moving my accounts into a new private one in my name only. The woman on the line asked if I wanted to set up a beneficiary, and I told her no. She hesitated, but didn't push. Hanging up, I felt a strange kind of power settle in my chest. It was the first time in years I felt like my life belonged only to me. That night, I searched for cruise lines on my laptop, scrolling past glossy brochures and promotional videos until one caught my eye. A ship called the Odyssey. They offered long-term residential cabins for people who wanted to live at sea. My heart raced as I clicked through pictures of airy staterooms and endless blue horizons. Without letting myself overthink it, I called and booked a 15-year lease on a cabin with an ocean view. For the next week, I went about my days as though nothing had changed. I nodded politely when my son dropped by, smiled faintly when my daughter-in-law reminded me about the facility she thought I should tour. But inside, every moment felt sharper, more alive. I kept my plans close to my chest, savoring the secret like a precious jewel. When the house finally sold, I signed the papers without a single tear. I handed over the keys, walked through the rooms one last time, and whispered a quiet goodbye. The moving truck came the next morning, but all it carried away was a small suitcase and a box of mementos. Everything else stayed behind. At the port, the Odyssey loomed in front of me, gleaming white against the water. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the salty air and feeling the weight of everything I was leaving behind, start to slip off my shoulders. I boarded slowly, my steps steady, each one louder in my own mind than the last. My cabin was waiting for me, sun pouring through the window, the sea stretching endlessly beyond. I set my bag down and stood at the glass watching as the dock crew untied the ropes. For the first time in decades, I felt free. As the ship began to move, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The screen flashed with my daughter-in-law's name, call after call, until finally I answered. Her voice was frantic, angry, and panicked all at once, demanding to know where I was, what I thought I was doing. I let her speak until she ran out of words, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Then I raised the phone to my ear and spoke softly. I told her I had nothing left to give them. I told her they had taken enough from me already. I told her they wouldn't be seeing me again. Then I hung up, set the phone down, and stepped out onto the balcony. The wind caught my hair. The horizon stretched wide and infinite, and I felt myself smile for the first time in a long, long time. The next morning, they must have come to the house expecting to find me at the kitchen table waiting for their next set of demands. Instead, they found the driveway empty and the front door locked with a bold red "sold" sign planted in the yard. I could almost picture my daughter-in-law standing there with her arms crossed and her mouth open, my son trailing behind her in stunned silence. The calls started as soon as they stepped inside and saw what was left behind. Voicemail after voicemail flooded my phone. First her voice sharp and brittle, demanding I explain myself. Then his softer but still laced with disbelief, asking me to call back and saying we could talk about this. I didn't pick up. I let their words pile up and fade into nothing while the ship pulled farther from shore. I stood on the balcony outside my cabin, hands resting on the cool rail, watching the shoreline shrink into the horizon. The lights of Jacksonville blurred into the dusk until they were no more than a faint glow. There was a strange quiet inside me as I stood there. For years, I had imagined this house, this family, as the only thing that kept me rooted. But now that I'd let it go, I didn't feel lost. I felt weightless. The phone buzzed again on the nightstand, and I glanced at it before turning back to the sea. Whatever they had to say didn't matter anymore. The wind tugged at my hair, salty and fresh, and I took the deepest breath I'd taken in years. It wasn't just about leaving them behind. It was about finding myself again. As the last sliver of land disappeared and all I could see was open water, I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time in decades, I wasn't someone's mother or someone's burden or someone's afterthought. I was just me, Margaret, a woman who still had years left to live on her own terms. The ship sailed steady through the waves, and as the stars began to appear overhead, I whispered goodbye to everything that had held me back. It felt good to finally set myself free. If you've listened this far, I want you to know something. You are never too old to choose yourself. No matter how many years you've given to other people, or how much of yourself you've poured into their lives, you still deserve a chance at happiness. For too long, I believed my worth was tied to what I could do for others. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, and that being a good mother, a good wife, a good teacher meant putting everyone else first. I let myself become smaller and smaller, until I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. But that night, holding that photograph of my classroom, I finally asked myself a question I'd never dared to before. What if I deserved more than this? What if the life I'd been waiting for was still out there, just beyond the horizon? Walking away from everything I'd known wasn't easy. Saying goodbye to the house I built and the memories that lived inside its walls broke my heart in ways I can't describe. But staying in a place where I wasn't valued, where I wasn't even seen anymore, would have broken me even more. I want you to understand that reclaiming your dignity doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to come with shouting or fighting. Sometimes it's just a quiet choice, a single step in a new direction, a decision to say no more. As I stand here now, leaning on the railing and watching the sun rise over the open sea, I feel lighter than I have in years. The air tastes like salt and possibility. I don't know where this ship will take me next, but for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what's ahead. If you're sitting there thinking you've missed your chance, or that you're too old to change, I want you to hear me when I say you're not. You can start over. You can take your power back. You can still dream. The world feels wide and full of promise tonight. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know it will belong to me. Out here on the water with nothing but the stars and the waves, I finally feel like I've come home. And so can you.